So this week we're going to talk a little bit about property rights. In this first lecture I want to talk about property in general and property's relationship to freedom and disability. Let me start off with a thought experiment for you guys. What are some important values that free societies should defend? Go on, take a minute, think about the sorts of things that matter to a free people. Alright, do you have a couple things? So, the first point I want to make is that nearly whatever values you hold dear, property rights can get in the way of realizing those values. Think about it for a second. If you if you like religious freedom, for example, but you have nowhere to exercise your religious freedom, literally if there were no public spaces, and if you were too poor to be able to afford a place of worship, and if you were a renter and your landlord did not want you to practice your religion for some reason within your rented apartment, then it's just not clear what is clear is that other people's property is getting in the way of your free exercise of religion. But think of any other goods, right? Perhaps you would like to go on a nice vacation, you'd like to travel, but of course one of the ways that you can't move around is that other people's property is in the way. You can't travel over other people's property. And so in order to travel, indeed, you must secure the use of some piece of property, whether it be a car, a plane ticket, a boat, whatever it might be. In order to travel, for the most part, you need property. And if you do not have access to that property, then you do not have access to travel. Again, whatever it is that you came up with in terms of values, I can probably demonstrate that property rights, especially other people's property rights, get in the way. But let me make a second point. Nearly whatever values you cited when I asked you that question, it's also the case that property rights can help you realize them, if they're your property rights, more specifically. So, again, if you like to if you would like to practice your religion freely, I can imagine that having access to a space that's yours can make a large difference in terms of being able to securely worship in your own way. Certainly, religious dissenters in England and elsewhere in Europe, when they came to the United States, one of the things they wanted was freedom of religion. One of the main ways they could secure that was property that they could call their own, so as not to have to depend on a landlord, particularly a large aristocratic landowner, who could then dictate that you go to certain services of a particular church, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what this thought experiment quickly tells us is that property is a double-edged sword, and we have to be careful what we're justifying when we're justifying property rights. If we do not want to define property rights both as a concept and as a substantive legal idea, that is to say what the government will defend, so as to make the pursuit of important values impossible. We want property rights, in other words, to help us pursue our values, not get in the way. And we know that property can do both. So, let me submit this to you. And again, this is a thesis that will have to be defended with reasons, but the way I want to submit this to you is as follows. Property rights can be either too strong or too weak. And indeed, we shouldn't make them too strong or too weak. A strong property right is when property rights permit more actions with respect to an object. And a weak property right is simply the opposite, when property rights permit fewer actions with respect to an object. And we're going to stick with the field of objects for now because that's the most tangible way of looking at property rights. But of course, we can think about property rights in non-tangible objects as well, property rights in ideas, patents, concepts. We could even talk about, in some cases, offices, right? Particular kinds of jobs you might have a property right in, and so on and so forth. But let's stick to objects for now. Now, before we go any further, I want to note that there's a distinction, at least a potential distinction, to be drawn between a moral right to property and a legal right to property. Right? A moral right to property is what you are morally entitled to. A legal right to property is whatever the state will defend. That is to say, whatever will be defended by the laws of the land. So in some cases, those two may come into conflict if the law does not recognize something that it should recognize, or in other cases, it may recognize property rights that it shouldn't recognize. Fights over squatters' rights and eminent domain can certainly bring this kind of conflict to a head, right? Where what we feel we are morally entitled to conflict, and indeed what we are morally entitled to in some cases, conflicts very clearly with what the law says and what the law is willing to defend. Second point that we should point out is that property rights are not one thing. Property ownership really is a bundle of separate rights. If I own something, that means usually that I have the right to sell it, the right to borrow against it, the right to rent it out for money perhaps, certainly the right to manage it, use it, be held liable in some cases for the harms of my use in that property, have certain judgments against me executed on that property, and so on and so forth. Right? So ownership is a bundle of rights and indeed duties, and it's not entirely clear what's in the bundle. So I don't think there's any clearly essential features of property rights. That is to say, if you were to tell me that in a society somewhere you would have the right to use and manage property and rent it out, but not the right to sell it, I would be hard-pressed to come up with a different concept than the concept of property rights. I'm sure lawyers could come up with a different word, or just make up a word for a property right which lacked the right to sell. But note that, generally speaking, the right to property combines a bundle of different rights, not all of which are entirely necessary to create it, to make it specifically a property right. We know that at some point, if you have too few rights with respect to an object, it suddenly doesn't look like a property right anymore. But how few rights, that's not entirely clear. But one thing that we can say about property rights is that at some level, a claim to a property right is a claim to the right to exclude, right? So if property rights do anything at all, they define some range, and again, it doesn't have to be a wide range, but some range of protected actions individuals have with respect to an object. This means that others may not interfere in more or less specific ways. This also means that others are not free to do what they wish with respect to an object. So, for instance, if I own this apple, right, that means that you are morally obligated and perhaps legally coerced as well to not interfere with my use of the apple within some range. So you can interfere if I try to throw it at you, but you can't interfere if I try to eat it. Which leads to point number 3, which is that when we have a moral right to property, that's going to bind you in conscience. And in particular, it's going to bind other people in conscience. That is to say that if you have a moral right, you are morally entitled to a piece of property, like say that apple that I was just talking about, that means that other people should not interfere in specific ways. But a legal property right will add a legal threat to that moral obligation. It will say not only do you not have a moral right to interfere with someone, but on top of that, if you do, you are subject to legal penalties. And so we want to keep legal property rights and moral property rights distinct, because moral property rights merely bind your conscience, whereas legal property rights constitute a threat to freedom, a threat to your freedom of action, and will give you very clear consequences if you violate those property rights. Now, normally, exclusion requires justification. That is to say that if anybody is going to interfere with your liberty, generally speaking, that creates a prima facie duty on their part to explain to you and give you a good justification as to why your liberty is being interfered with, because we generally tend to think that people, unless otherwise notified, are free. And Locke, in his piece, which you had to read for today, or hopefully that you've already read, Locke attempts to provide this sort of justification. What could provide a binding reason to not interfere with somebody else's liberty, or what could provide a reason to in fact interfere with their liberty. Okay, so for that reason I think property is almost certainly related to freedom in some ways. Property prescribes a sphere of action within which no man has to listen to anything else but his reason and his conscience. In that sense, it provides a space for you to be free to exercise your will however you wish to do so. But property also provides the means to exercise other freedoms, right? So if you have a property right in a physical object or a piece of land, for instance, this enables you to do things. If you have a car, this enables you to exercise your freedom of movement and travel. So providing the means to exercise other freedoms is a way to say it provides you with a way of making those freedoms valuable, right? So without money, my right to buy a car is not worth very much to me because I can't do it. Without, property, my right to, I don't know, start a business, for instance, might be a little bit less valuable because I have nothing to borrow against when I go to the bank to ask for a loan, right? So property provides the means to exercise other freedoms, and that's important to retain. And when secure, it also provides a measure of independence from the state and from other citizens. That is to say, when you have property, you're not dependent on a landlord if it's physical property and land. You're not dependent on somebody else giving you a ride if it's a car. You're not dependent on somebody else's textbook if it's a textbook that you don't have for a class, right? So when you have secure property rights, that gives you independence. And a lot of people value independence for its own sake. Historically, it's worth noting that property has always distinguished different categories or statuses of citizen, right? Lords and peasants, right? The lords have property, the peasants don't, by definition. Capitalists and wage workers, right? The capitalists have the means of production. They own the factories and the businesses. The wage workers don't. They just own their labor, and they have to exchange it for wages. Again, freeholders from serfs, voters from non-voters. It used to be the case that in order to vote, you had to have property, right? This wasn't so long ago. That voting, in order to vote, it was thought that you had to have a stake in the system. And not having property meant in some sense that you didn't have a stake. But property is, like we said earlier, a double-edged sword. It's also intimately related to coercion or disability. Every time that someone has a property right, that's enforced against the liberty of someone else, right? So if I own this apple, that means you can't come take it from me. You are not free to do something that presumably if I didn't own the apple, you would be free to do. Same thing for a piece of land. Prior to my owning this piece of land, one would assume that you would be free to go ahead and walk across it, do what you want with it. But now that I own it, you can't do that. It's also worth noting, and this is a point that's been made many times throughout history, which is the concentrated distributions of property rights. Like if the state owns all the property, as in a communist dictatorship, or if a particular class of wealthy landowners own all the land, concentrated distributions of property rights can substantially prevent large numbers of people from effectively being the authors of their own life. What that means is that even though you might have formal liberties, if you lack the means to exercise those liberties, and in particular if you lack secure property rights, at the end of the day, you will, in some sense, be less free. You will be, I would say, disabled in some ways from authoring your own plan of life, because your plan of life will constantly be dependent on the will and the whims of an elite class, or, in some cases, the state. Okay, more on this in an upcoming lecture.